Some of you might remember the phrase space, the final frontier. In today's world, it's not the space, it's the cyberspace that's one of the most important levels of human activity, both on the individual, industrial, business, and administrative levels. So this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about cyberspace as the space of the final conflict and final competition between states. To talk about cyberspace, we need to talk about definitions. And as simple as it might sound, it's anything but simple. There's a myriad of definitions of cyberspace. Each and every national legal system has a slightly different one. We don't have international regulations stating what cyberspace is. And so we need at least one, to ground us and to give us a benchmark, a reference point for our discussions about cyberspace as a field of conflict. And so to use the simplest one that you can think about is just listing the elements of cyberspace and their most important functions. The first one will be this. The cyberspace is the global domain, and its functions are mainly connected with information and information environment, information gathering, information processing, information storage, and information dissemination. It consists of the network of networks, so not only computers connected within the individual single network, but also the connections between those networks. This is what we call quite often the internet. It also includes telecom networks. It includes computer systems, processors, controllers. And so we have two of those most important elements of cyberspace. The first one being the virtual space and the virtual environment of information processing. And the second one being the physical infrastructure, the IT infrastructure that grounds this virtual reality in the material reality around us. We need the physical dimension mainly in order to create the interface between us and the digital domain. We, so far, don't have an ability to look into this digital world without the bridging of computer, smartphone, tablet, laptop, anything that lets us have a look inside the digitally described and the digitally recreated world. And the third one, although it might not seem very natural, the third element is just us. The relations between people that are created via the computers, the activity of the users. We quite often say that today's world of internet is something that we call Web 2.0, so the second generation of World Wide Web, the generation that allows the users not only to passively read the content and acquire the content, but also makes us the creators of this content. The next stage, quite obviously, is also here. It's the web that includes also something that's called Internet of Things. So the data that is generated and processed by the machines that are present in the computer networks. The fourth one will be probably, or some might say it already is, the web in which the artificial intelligence and the large language models will be also the creators of the content and the architects of the electronic infrastructures that build and create cyberspace. And so those three elements, the physical, the virtual, and the human one, are the pillars of what we call cyberspace. And so we've talked about the elements that build cyberspace. But what about the characteristics of this very, very popular and yet quite unknown environment in which we undertake the activities? We as individuals, we as businesses, we as states and armies and other institutions and organizations that are present and that realize their tasks or acquire and realize their goals in this virtual environment. The first and probably most natural is the global reach. There are no borders in cyberspace. The global domain is exactly that. You can't stop the flow of information, and you do have almost real-time access to the events and information about events on the other side of the world. Unfortunately, that means also that you have a global reach to a potential competitor and he has the access to you. And so it's not only the conflict that's between the neighbors in the close neighborhood of your state. You might actually be attacked by the competitor in the global economy that's situated on the other side of the world. The second important characteristic of cyberspace is the fact that it does function 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It never stops. The information cycle never stops. Do you know what one could do just a few years ago in order to, for example, drown the information that was uncomfortable from the point of view of the government, for example, or large media? It was enough to inform the public, quote unquote, about this important event late on the Friday afternoon. Late on the Friday afternoon, because when we only had a paper press, usually the newspapers were already being printed for the weekend, and so we were left with no access to information and no processing of information with the public wide access for 2 days. And usually over the weekend something new was happening, and so this very important or controversial information might have been well drowned before the Monday came. Right now it's completely impossible. The information environment functions 24/7, again with the real-time access to information. The third function is quite obviously the anonymity. If one knows what one is doing, one can perfectly cover their digital footprint and can quite assuredly provide themselves with the anonymity over the internet. From some points of view, it's quite all right in the countries that are dictatorships or authoritarian countries. For the freedom fighters and people who fight for democracy and human rights, it's great that they can hide behind this wall of anonymity provided, for example, by the Tor servers, so the onion ring servers. Unfortunately, that also provides the anonymity for criminals, for people who do bad things over the internet, from committing the internet fraud up to dissemination of illegal content, from disinformation up to child pornography. The speed with which things are happening on the internet, the speed is as quick as the flow of information, which in this digital environment, it's almost instantaneous. The only barrier here is our cognitive ability to process this information. The real-time communication we've already covered, but the transfer of traditional threats into the cyberspace is something that's worth noting. It's not only new threats, it's not only the new crimes, it's not only the new ways in which the cyberspace can threaten us. It's also the advent of very traditional crimes, frauds, thefts that have moved into the cyberspace and have, to some extent, widened the group of people who would be ready to commit a crime because of the fact that this crime might be committed from another country, that it might be committed very anonymously. And the last fact, the fact that complicates things when it comes to providing the security and fighting crime and counteracting, for example, the terrorist use of cyberspace and of the internet is the low regulation. It's quite natural that the legal systems are not really able to keep the pace with the advancing technology. We are much better at creating new technologies and creating new technological solutions than we are at regulating them, and that's sort of an inherent problem. We need the legal systems to stay consistent, to stay conservative, to be well thought, while the wild, wild west of the technological advancement that is controlled by the private entities rather than states creates a situation in which we are almost always a few steps behind when it comes to regulating those new technologies. An additional problem, quite obviously, is the fact that around the cyberspace and about the freedom of speech which is provided by the communication technologies on the internet, there are political problems, there are political competing views about how to regulate those issues, because there are different countries in the international community with different approaches to the freedom of speech and what the citizens can and can not only say, but also what kinds of information they're allowed to reach on the global network. And this last point, the very natural issue of us wanting to be able to rely on the law and so wanting this law to be sort of slow moving and sort of conservative has a natural consequence. We are functioning in the state of very low regulations in the cyberspace, which means that our cautiousness about how we move there, how we protect ourselves, and how we protect also the states and their citizens and also the private sector is quite an important function of people and institutions being aware of the threats and being proactive rather than reactive in creating the security systems and security policies when it comes to security in cyberspace. And so the functioning in cyberspace is actually quite complicated. It's complicated in times of peace. We already know, because we have already talked about the fact that the borders between peace and war right now become quite blurred. And so there are two factors that complicate our functioning and building the security solutions in cyberspace. The first one is the technological complexity of this environment, and the second one is the fact that with the anonymity that's provided by the new technologies, the anonymity of the state that can hide behind, for example, of the backs of the group of hackers or the organized criminal groups, it's very difficult to say that we are actually at war in cyberspace. The next milestone when it comes to complexity and difficulty of finding the proper balance point when it comes to security in cyberspace came in 2016. In 2016, there was a NATO summit that took place in Warsaw. During this NATO summit, the leaders of the alliance stated that the cyberspace is actually the fourth domain of war. Apart from land, sea, and air, the leaders of NATO stated that our ability to protect ourselves, to protect the allies, to protect the citizens, not only might, but also must be as good as in any other domain of war. This is actually quite characteristic. You might have noticed that I've said that it's the fourth domain of war, and one might ask, why not fifth? Why not air, land, sea, and space? Well, in 2016, although it was after the Russian occupation of Crimea and the attacks in the eastern borders of Ukraine, we still believed that there is a chance for the demilitarized space, for the cosmos that would be actually free from the competing, at least on the military level. It's not so anymore. We do understand that, unfortunately, the cyberspace became the fifth domain of war rather than the fourth one. And so what was said during this 2016 summit was that the leaders are reaffirming NATO's defensive mandate and recognize cyberspace as the domain that requires defense as robust as the land, sea and air. What is implied in this declaration that we recognize cyberspace as the fourth domain of war is that if we are attacked in cyberspace, we might in fact respond in the material world with a kinetic conflict. This is actually a milestone. This means that the cyber attack against the state might be responded to with the use of actual military force. And so espionage, warfare, crime, terrorism, all of those take place not only on the military level that might be directed against the civilian targets, mainly because of the fact that this is something that we really need to note. There is almost no level of state's functioning that's not harnessed to some extent in the functioning and proper control over the computer systems, the electricity, the public transportation, the access to health services, the access to financial services. They are all of those domains or states functioning are to some extent steered by the computers and controlled by the computers, which is why the potential war in cyberspace will not only be a war against the intelligent weapons. It's not only going to be a war about the influencing the friend or foe recognition systems. It's going to be a war against the state, not only in its military, but also in its civilian form. And so, to some extent, we have spoiled the question, or rather the answer to the question about, well, it's bits and bytes. So what can actually happen? What can actually be the consequence of the cyber attack? We fight for cyberspace, the influence in cyberspace and control in cyberspace, because the cyberspace and its individual elements, and we have noticed that it's not only the virtual processing space but also the critical IT infrastructure, is everywhere and it controls everything. The clean water in our pipes, the filters are controlled and the quality of water is dependent on the computers that constantly analyze the data about the pipes that are about the water that is flowing in our pipes. It's the energy, it's the public transportation. Do you remember these are the classics, but you might remember them. The Die Hard movies, Die Hard 2 and Die Hard 4.0. The first of those two mentioned movies is about the attack in the airport in which somebody takes over the control over the control tower and changes the way in which computers that are controlling the approach of the airplanes to the surface of the airport sees this level of the surface, the terrain ahead. They see them a few feet under the actual level of terrain, which means that they crash because the computer thinks that there's still a free space when it comes to touching the ground. The Die Hard 4.0, well, this one is actually quite funny. It's the Die Hard hero fighting against the hacker groups. But the case that starts in this Die Hard 4.0 movie is actually quite interesting. It's the case of taking over the traffic light in the city. And the only thing that the hackers do then is actually turning all the lights green. And when all lights turn green, everybody goes. We might think about ourselves as anti-system people. We might think that we distrust the government. We might think that we are in conflict of the tax payment. But when we see the traffic light turning green, we simply go. And what happens if on every crossroad in the whole city, everybody starts going at the same time? Well, on almost each and every crossroads, there is a car crash or car catastrophe. And what happens then? Well, quite obviously, those cars are not going anymore anywhere. There are people who are wounded. And so people start calling the police and start calling the fire brigades and start calling the ER services. And soon the telecommunication network is overwhelmed. And because of the traffic jams, no rescue services are going anywhere. And think about how easy that is, how easy that would be to just simply turn each and every traffic light green. This is what we're talking about. This is the level of control that computers have over our reality. But it's also quite obviously extremely important from the point of view of the defense systems, of the systems that allowed, for example, our air defenses to recognize whether or not the airplane, the jet fighter, is our own or it belongs to our enemy. So the friend or foe recognition systems, the intelligent weapons, the financial systems, computers control everything. This is why the cyber war is so important, not because of the bits and the bytes and control over data and information, although this one is also extremely important because this is the basis for making the rational decisions, but because of the deep influence that the computers and the data in computers have over our physical, material reality. You might say that's not true, that if that were true, something like that would happen. Well, not only did it happen more than once, but we have one very widely discussed case of such attacks, and this was the attack by the malware that was called Stuxnet. Stuxnet was created with the greatest probability within the framework of cooperation between the US and Israel, and this was the malware that was directed against the nuclear facilities in Iran. And so it was quite successfully used in order to influence the SCADA systems that control industrial processes. It was used to mess with the computer controllers of the centrifuges that were used to enrich uranium, which has quite successfully adversely influenced the Iranian nuclear program. And that's not it. As I've said, the Stuxnet did not influence the Windows controlled computer systems. It influenced the systems called SCADA, and you might think that does not interest me that much. I mean, I'm not working at the industrial facility. Well, you would be unfortunately deeply mistaken, because the SCADA systems are exactly the systems that are being used, for example, in smart homes, in industrial buildings and in intelligent buildings. So quite often, while using the elevator in the skyscraper, you are exactly there where SCADA is working and where it might actually be accessed in order to mess with the transportation within this building. Cyberspace is everywhere and it controls everything. This is why the cyber war is probably one of the greatest threats that we face. We will talk about more phases of the modern threats in the new episodes of Dr. Piasecka's Dangerous Topics.